We are moving on to multiplication of rational numbers. So what we want to accomplish in this video are how do you multiply decimal values, how do you multiply fractions, what are multiplicative inverses, and how do you multiply mixed numbers. So again, working into these operations with all of our rational numbers. So multiplying positives and negatives, recall the rules for multiplying positives and negatives for integers. They're the same thing for rational numbers as well. So there's nothing new we need to remember as far as multiplying positives and negatives go. Recall that if the signs are the same, that means positive, positive, or negative and negative, that product is going to be positive. Same signs, product is positive. If we have different signs, a positive times a negative or a negative times a positive, then your answer or your product is going to be negative. Those rules apply the same for rational numbers, the same as they did for integers. So multiplying decimals. Multiplying decimals, recall, you just multiply the numbers, and we're going to ignore the decimals for now. And then to determine where the decimal goes in the product, the total number of numbers behind the decimal in the problem determines how many numbers are behind the decimal in the product. So for example, we have 8.32 times 2.5. To multiply this, I'm just going to multiply it as if the decimals weren't there. So I'm going to take 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 3 is 15, plus 1 is 16, and 5 times 8 is 40, plus 1 is 41. Add a 0. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 8 is 16, and then add these together, 0, 10, 8, 10, 2. And now where does the decimal go in my product? Well, in the problem, there are 1, 2, 3 numbers behind the decimal point total. So I count 1, 2, 3 numbers. That's how many numbers will be behind the decimal in the product. So my answer is 20.800 or just 20.8. So there's a quick refresher on multiplying decimal values. Now, what if we have positives and negatives together? Where we're going to multiply them just like we multiply decimals, and we're going to apply the rules of multiplication that we learned with integers. Here we have negative 9.33 times 8.2. So this is a negative times a positive. So I know my product is going to be negative. So I just need to remember at the end, I know my answer is going to be negative. Now I just need to multiply these numbers like I would multiply any decimal numbers to find my product. 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 9 is 18. Add a 0. 8 times 3 is 24, carry the 2. 8 times 3 is 24, plus 2 is 26, carry the 2. And 8 times 9 is 72, plus 2 is 74. Add these together, 6, 10, 15, 6, 7. And there are 1, 2, 3 numbers behind a decimal in the problem. There should be 3 numbers behind the decimal in my answer, so my decimal place goes there. And remember, I know my product was going to be negative. Do not forget to put the negative on there if it belongs there. Negative 76.506 is my product. Next, 12.1 times 4, negative 4.2. This is a negative times a negative, so I know that my product is going to be positive. So I'm just going to multiply these numbers without the negatives because I know this is going to end up to be positive. 12.1 times 4.2, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 1 is 2, add a 0, 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, and 4 times 1 is 4. Add these together, 2, 8, 10, carry the 1, 5. There are 1, 2 numbers behind the decimal in the problem. There should be 1, 2 numbers behind the decimal in the answer. And I know this is going to be positive because it was a negative times a negative. 50.82 is my product. And that's multiplying decimals, pretty straightforward. Multiplying fractions, even more straightforward. We're going to multiply the numerators, we're going to multiply the denominators, and then simplify the fraction if possible. So really top times top, bottom times bottom, and then simplify. So we're going to multiply the numerators, multiply the denominators. So in this case, 3/4 times 5/6 would be 15 24ths. And that can be simplified. These are both divisible by 3. We can simplify that to 5/8. And then again, we are going to apply our rules of multiplication for positives and negatives as well. So negative 5/8 times 7/10. We're going to multiply the numerators together. This is a negative times a positive, so I know it's going to be negative 35 80ths. Now this can be simplified. These are both divisible by 5, and that is -7/16 when I simplify it. There's my answer. Here, -6/7 times -4/5. A negative times a negative is going to be positive, so I just need to multiply the numerators together. I get 24. Denominators, I get 35. And that is actually simplified, and that's going to be positive because it was a negative times a negative. 24/35 is my answer there. And that's multiplying fractions. What are multiplicative inverses? Now, this is a very important concept, so please make sure you have this in your notes and understand what these are. Multiplicative inverses are two numbers that have a product of 1. When you multiply them together, you get 1, and they're also called reciprocals. Okay, reciprocal is another name for a multiplicative inverse. So those are synonyms: reciprocals, multiplicative inverses. So look at this example here. I have 2/3 times 3/2. And when I multiply these together, I get 6/6, which is 1. So you'll notice that these two fractions are kind of mirror images of each other. One is flipped over version of the other one, and that's what reciprocals or multiplicative inverses really are. When you flip a fraction over, it becomes the inverse of what it started out to be, because you will always get the same thing in the numerator as you do in the denominator when you multiply them together, which is always equals 1. So these are reciprocals of each other. Now here I have 1/2 times 2. Now, if you think of 2 as a fraction, it's 2/1. If you'll remember talking about rational numbers, that's 2/1. And 1/2 and 2/1 are kind of those mirror image fractions of each other. We call those reciprocals or multiplicative inverses, because when you multiply these together, you're going to get the same thing in the numerator as you do in the denominator, because it's 1 times 2 and 2 times 1. You're going to get the same thing, and when that happens, that is equivalent to 1. Now, mixed numbers can have reciprocals as well, but you have to view them as improper fractions first. So here we have 4 2/3 times 3/14. Now, looking at it, it doesn't look like they're reciprocals of each other, but if you write 4 2/3 as an improper fraction, it's 14/3. So 14/3 and 3/14 are those mirror image fractions of each other, or reciprocals, that are called multiplicative inverses, because when we multiply them together, we get the same thing in the numerator as we do in the denominator, 42/42, which is always equal to 1. And that's a very important thing to know when it comes to learning pre-algebra or algebra in the future, is this concept of a multiplicative inverse. Next, multiplying mixed numbers. How do we multiply mixed numbers? Lots of ways to multiply mixed numbers, but I think the most straightforward way to do it is to do what we've always been doing with these mixed numbers, is to change them into fractions and then multiply them like fractions. Top times top, bottom times bottom, and then simplify. So the example here, 5 2/3 times 4 1/2. These written as fractions, 5 2/3 is 17/3. And 4 1/2 is 9/2, and then I can just multiply straight across here to get 153/6, which as a mixed number is 25 3/6, which simplifies to 25 1/2. So again, a little extra step involved with mixed numbers, but much of the same as multiplying fractions. So here's a couple examples multiplying mixed numbers. 8 2/3, -8 2/3 times 6 1/5. This is a negative times a positive, so I know my product is going to be negative. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I convert these to improper fractions. I have -26/3 times 31/5. And when I multiply these together, I get -806/15. And then if you write that as a mixed number, that's -53 11/15. And there's my product there. Next, -1 3/4 times -5 5/6. I know this is going to be a positive because it's a negative times a negative. So if I write these as improper fractions, I get -7/4 times -35/6. And then when I multiply the numerators together, I get a positive 245, and the denominators together I get 24, and that is 10 5/24. Positive because it was a negative times a negative, and there's my result. So multiplying fractions, multiplying decimals, and multiplying mixed numbers.